Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The phone call came without warning, but the moment it rang, everything changed. Richard Lawson, the CEO of one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, glanced at the screen. The name on the display read, Maddie, Blind Date Coordinator. He sighed, already preparing himself for the forced pleasantries he'd soon have to endure. Another blind date, another pointless attempt at rekindling a spark that had long since gone out of his life. He swiped the screen and answered. "Richard, we've set up your date for tonight." Maddie's voice chirped from the other end, too enthusiastic for a man who lived and breathed business, not relationships. "Let me guess. Someone perfect for me?" he replied dryly, leaning back in his chair. His office was a sleek, modern space filled with cold steel and glass, everything perfectly placed. But tonight he couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. Perhaps it was the pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar empire, or the relentless pursuit of perfection that left little room for anything genuine in his life. "Yes, Richard, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You'll meet her at a new Italian restaurant downtown at 8. Her name's Emily. Just be yourself. I'm sure you two will get along." He was silent for a moment, staring at the view from his office window, the city skyline illuminated by the evening's fading light. He hated these things, yet there was no way out. His friends had practically pushed him into this, and his assistant, who seemed to have more faith in love than he did, kept signing him up for these experiments. "Fine," Richard muttered, hanging up before Maddie could say more. At 7:45 p.m., Richard stepped out of his sleek black limousine, the door slamming behind him as he adjusted his tie. The evening air was crisp, and the sound of his polished shoes echoing on the pavement seemed to be a reminder that he was alone, always alone. As he entered the restaurant, the scent of fresh pasta and sizzling garlic filled the air. The soft murmur of conversation and clinking of glasses created a relaxed atmosphere, but for Richard it felt suffocating. He was here because it was expected of him, not because he wanted to be. A tall, elegant hostess approached him, her heels clicking as she led him toward a secluded corner. "Your date is already here, Mr. Lawson. She's waiting for you." Richard followed her through the maze of tables, his gaze flicking briefly to the people dining, couples, friends, businessmen, all living lives that seemed far more simple, far more fulfilling than his own. He didn't allow himself to linger on those thoughts. Not tonight. When they reached the table, the hostess gestured toward the woman sitting there, a glass of red wine in front of her. Richard didn't immediately sit down. He was too busy taking in the sight before him. The woman was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in loose waves, and her sharp, intelligent eyes were framed by delicate features. She had a presence that could not be ignored. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else about her, something deeper that intrigued him immediately. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and calm, without the nerves he had come to expect from these blind dates. "Richard Lawson, I presume." Richard, taken aback by her directness, nodded and sat down. "Yes, and you must be Emily." She smiled, but there was no typical fake warmth behind it. Instead, there was a sincerity that piqued his curiosity. "Emily Hawkins," she replied, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure." They shook hands, and Richard was taken aback by the firm grip she offered. There was strength there, an unspoken confidence that made him pause. He couldn't quite place it, but it was clear that she wasn't like the others. "I must admit I'm a bit surprised," Richard said, his tone betraying the faintest hint of curiosity. "You don't seem like someone who would go for these sorts of setups." Emily's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I've learned not to judge too quickly. After all, you never know when a blind date might lead to something. Unexpected. Richard raised an eyebrow. She was different, and that difference was something he wasn't prepared for. Most of his blind dates had been filled with awkward silences, forced conversations about mutual friends, and an endless round of rehearsed questions. But Emily was different. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying too hard to impress him. It was as if she wasn't here to win him over, but to have a conversation, to share a moment, something that felt like an anomaly in his carefully controlled life. "Tell me something about yourself, Emily," Richard said, his tone more relaxed than usual. The words came out of his mouth before he even had time to stop them. He was intrigued, and for a man who never allowed himself to be intrigued, that was saying something. Emily's gaze softened for a moment, and she took a sip of her wine before responding. "Well, I'm originally from a small town. Moved to the city a few years ago to pursue a career in marketing. Nothing too exciting, I'm afraid." Richard studied her for a moment. There was something in her eyes, a hint of something darker, something more complicated. He had seen enough people in his life to recognize when they were hiding something, when there was more to the story than they were willing to tell. Emily was doing that now. She was holding something back. Before he could press further, the waiter arrived, and they ordered their meals in relative silence. The atmosphere between them shifted, a quiet tension hanging in the air. But Richard couldn't help it. He was drawn to her in a way he hadn't been with anyone in a long time. What was it about Emily Hawkins that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something big, something that could change his life? The thought gnawed at him as they ate, the air between them thick with unspoken words. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself lost in their conversation. She spoke of her childhood, her dreams, her aspirations, and yet there was something she wasn't saying, something that kept slipping through the cracks of her story, like a hidden secret waiting to be discovered. And then, just when Richard thought he could let his guard down, she said something that made his heart skip a beat. "I think we're both here for the same reason, Richard," Emily said quietly, looking him dead in the eyes, "to find something real, something we can't ignore." Richard froze. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. How could she have known? He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. It was as if her words had taken the air from his lungs. And that was when it happened, the moment that would set the course for everything to come. The connection between them was undeniable, raw, and filled with an electricity that neither of them could ignore. Richard Lawson, the billionaire CEO, was no longer in control of the situation. He had been pulled into something much bigger than himself, a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The night was far from over, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Emily. The conversation flowed, yet a peculiar tension lingered in the air. As the meal came to an end, Richard noticed that Emily had grown quieter, her eyes sometimes wandering as though she were lost in a thought, something she hadn't yet shared. Richard was no stranger to secrets. His life, built on business deals and high-stakes negotiations, was filled with more than his fair share of untold truths. But there was something about Emily, something that made him feel exposed. She had a way of peering into him, beyond the facade he had built up over the years. "You've been quiet for a while," Richard remarked, his voice slightly strained, though he tried to sound casual. "Are you okay?" Emily smiled faintly, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, she swirled her glass of wine, watching the deep red liquid swirl around. "I'm fine," she said finally, but there was something in her tone that didn't quite match the words. "Just thinking about how unexpected this night has been." Richard leaned back in his chair, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" She placed her wineglass down with deliberate slowness, locking eyes with him. "It's just, I never imagined meeting someone like you this way. I've always been skeptical about these blind dates, you know." Richard couldn't help but let out a small laugh, though it was somewhat strained. "Same here," he admitted, "but I was more or less forced into it." "I can tell," she said with a knowing smile. "You don't seem like the type to let anyone push you into anything." Her perceptiveness was unsettling, and for the first time that evening, Richard felt as if he were the one being sized up. His mind raced, trying to decipher the layers of meaning in her words. There was something else beneath the surface of her calm demeanor, something she wasn't revealing. "Why did you agree to this?" Richard asked, suddenly curious about her own motivations. It was only fair, after all. He had told her bits and pieces of his life, and yet she had remained largely an enigma. "You seem like you're a woman who doesn't do things she doesn't want to do." Emily's smile faded a little, and her gaze turned downward, momentarily lost in the folds of her thoughts. The quiet moment between them felt charged, heavy. It was as if she was struggling with a decision, whether to tell him the truth or remain silent. Finally, she spoke. "I have my reasons," she said softly, but her voice had taken on a note of guardedness that Richard could sense immediately. "Let's just say I'm here because I need something I haven't been able to get elsewhere." Richard felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A feeling of unease crawled up his spine, though he couldn't place why. Something wasn't adding up. "And what is that?" he asked, a small frown creasing his forehead as he leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever truth she was hiding. For a moment, she didn't answer, as if weighing whether or not she could trust him. Then, with a quiet sigh, she placed her hands on the table, intertwining her fingers. "I'm not here to get anything from you, Richard," she said, her voice now steady and calm, though the words carried an undertone of something more. "But there's something I need to say, something that might change everything." Richard's pulse quickened. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. In fact, he wasn't sure anyone could ever be prepared for what Emily was about to reveal. "I didn't want to tell you this, not tonight, but I can't pretend anymore," she continued, her eyes meeting his once again, this time with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. "I'm not just a secretary, Richard. I'm connected to something much bigger, something that might put us both in danger." Danger! Richard's mind spun as he tried to process her words. Danger? What did she mean by that? "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low, trying to maintain control over the shock and confusion that had begun to bubble inside him. Emily exhaled sharply, her gaze darting around the room, as though checking to see if anyone was listening in on their conversation. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she said, "I'm connected to a group of people who are after something you have, and I'm involved in this whether I want to be or not." Richard's heart rate spiked. He leaned forward in his chair, the shock setting in. "What group? What do they want from me?" She looked down at her hands, seemingly trying to gather her thoughts before continuing. "They want information, Richard. Information about your company, your latest project. They've been watching you for months." His mind raced, but he could barely keep up. Who was she talking about? Who would want information on his company? He had no enemies, at least none that he could think of. But if what Emily said was true, then this went beyond business competition. This was something far more dangerous. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice shaky. "Why are you involved in this? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of regret. "Because I didn't have a choice. I didn't come here to deceive you, Richard. I came because I'm running out of time. And I'm afraid, if I don't stop them, I won't be the only one who pays the price." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air between them. Richard sat there, stunned, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. He had always prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life, on being several steps ahead of anyone who might try to outmaneuver him. But now, for the first time, he was caught completely off guard. "I don't even know who to trust right now," he muttered, his mind in chaos. This is all too much. Emily's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You have to trust me, Richard. I'm the only one who can help you. And if you don't believe me, you need to look at the signs. Look at what's happening around you. It's already started." Richard stared at her, unsure whether he should believe her. This couldn't be happening. His life couldn't be threatened by some faceless group that Emily was tied to. But deep down, a part of him knew that what she was saying was not just some wild fantasy. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but only one thing became clear. His life was no longer the same. Everything had changed in the span of a single dinner. "I need answers," Richard said, his voice firm now as the realization sank in. "What is this group? Who are they? And how can I stop them?" Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around his. "I can tell you everything, but not here. Not now. This place isn't safe anymore." Her words sent a chill through Richard's veins. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, in his own business, that he hadn't noticed the storm brewing around him. And now, Emily was pulling him into it, into something dark, dangerous, and completely out of his control. As the evening wore on, their conversation continued in hushed tones. But as Richard looked into Emily's eyes, he knew that this was just the beginning. There was no going back now. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and everything he thought he knew about his life was about to change forever. The night had barely begun, but Richard could already feel the shift in his world. What had started as a simple dinner date, arranged by a well-meaning assistant, had quickly transformed into a mystery that threatened to spiral out of control. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "I'm connected to a group of people who are after something you have." She was no longer just a secretary. She was part of something larger, something much more dangerous. And now, as he sat across from her in the dimly lit restaurant, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake by agreeing to this meeting. Richard's thoughts raced. Who could be after him? His company had been the dominant force in the tech industry for years, but it wasn't the kind of target that would attract threats from faceless groups. He wasn't an international arms dealer or a mafia boss. He was just a businessman, successful, driven, and always playing it safe. But what if the stakes were higher than he realized? What if Emily was right? "Tell me everything," Richard said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. He wasn't going to sit here and let uncertainty cloud his judgment. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Emily hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering nervously before she spoke. "I can't tell you everything, not yet, but I can give you a glimpse of what's happening." She paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the rim of her wineglass. "There's a group, a shadow organization. They've been tracking your company's progress for years, and now they've set their sights on your latest project, the one you've been keeping under wraps." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He had worked tirelessly on this new project. It was his brainchild, the thing that would revolutionize his company and push him ahead of the competition. He couldn't fathom how anyone could know about it, especially someone like Emily. "Why me?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would they want anything to do with my project? What do they hope to gain?" "I don't know exactly," Emily replied, her voice low and tense. "But I've heard whispers. They want access to the technology, to the information, and they'll do anything to get it." Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. This was no longer just about a business deal or a simple misunderstanding. Someone was after his most prized creation, and Emily, whether by choice or by force, had somehow become tangled in the web. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "How could this be happening? I've been careful. I've kept everything under lock and key." Emily's eyes darkened. "That's what I thought too, but they've got people everywhere, Richard. inside your company, in your competitors, even in your own circle. They've been waiting for the right moment to strike. The words hit Richard like a blow to the stomach. How could he have been so blind? He had always thought that his empire was built on solid ground, that his success was a result of his hard work and ingenuity, but now he realized that it was all a fragile house of cards, and someone was waiting for the perfect moment to tear it all down. "What do we do now?" Richard asked, his voice tight with frustration. "How do we stop them?" Emily's gaze flickered to the door, her expression tense. She lowered her voice as if speaking any louder would attract attention. "We need to move quickly. I've already made arrangements to get you out of here. They've been watching you." Richard frowned. "Watching me? Are you serious? How do you know?" Emily's face hardened. "Because I've seen them. I've seen their people, and they've been following you for days. I'm not sure how much they know, but we don't have time to figure that out. We need to go now." Before Richard could respond, Emily stood up, her movements swift and purposeful. Richard followed her lead, his mind still reeling from everything she had just told him. This was not what he had imagined when he agreed to this date. There were no words, no reason for him to understand what was happening. It was just chaos. Emily led him through the restaurant's back entrance and into the alley behind it. The cool air hit Richard's face as he stepped into the street, his pulse racing. His eyes scanned the area, looking for anything out of place, but the alley seemed quiet, too quiet. "What now?" Richard asked, his voice sharp with anxiety. "We need to get to the car. I've arranged for someone to take us somewhere safe," Emily replied, her voice calm but filled with urgency. They walked quickly, Richard's mind still processing everything that had happened. As they neared the end of the alley, Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and immediately stopped in her tracks, her face going pale. "What is it?" Richard asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "Trouble," Emily muttered, her voice tight. She looked around, her eyes scanning the street. "We're not alone. They've found us." Richard's eyes widened. He spun around, but the street was empty. The soft hum of city life continued around them, oblivious to the danger that was closing in. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him closer to her. "Get in the car, now," she said, urgency in her voice. "We need to leave before they get here." Before Richard could ask another question, a black SUV appeared at the far end of the street. It was moving fast, and as it approached, Richard could feel the sense of dread intensifying. Emily's grip on his arm tightened, and she practically shoved him toward the car. They slid into the back seat, and the driver immediately hit the gas, pulling away from the curb. Richard glanced out the window, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was something far worse. He had no idea who was after him, why, or how to stop them. All he knew was that he was in deeper than he ever imagined. As the car sped through the city streets, Emily turned to him, her face serious. "Listen to me, Richard," she said, her tone forceful. "I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm doing this because I have no other choice, and neither do you." Richard nodded slowly, still processing the gravity of the situation. "I don't understand," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "What is this group? Who are they? What do they want with me?" Emily hesitated before answering, her eyes shifting to the rearview mirror. "They're not just after you, Richard. They're after something much bigger, something they believe you're the key to." Richard's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, her expression troubled. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "They want to control the future, Richard, and they believe your project holds the key to that future." Richard's heart sank. He hadn't realized it before, but now it was clear. His project, the one he had poured his heart and soul into, wasn't just a business venture. It was a weapon that could change everything. The car sped through the darkened streets, its tires screeching as it took sharp turns, avoiding the growing chaos in its wake. Richard sat in silence beside Emily, the only sound between them, the hum of the engine and the occasional screech of rubber meeting pavement. His thoughts were racing, a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and growing fear. Emily's words echoed. In his mind, they want to control the future. They believe your project holds the key to that future. Control the future. The phrase kept repeating itself over and over until it seemed like the only thing that mattered. Richard's project, the one he had spent countless hours developing, the one that was meant to elevate his company to unprecedented heights, had somehow become the focal point of something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Emily, for all her calm demeanor, seemed just as shaken as he was. She hadn't said much since the car had taken off. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her hands tightly gripping her phone, as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Richard had so many questions, but none of them seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered now was survival. "Where are we going?" Richard asked finally, his voice low, almost as if afraid that speaking any louder would make their reality more terrifying. Emily turned to him, her face a mask of determination, though Richard could see the flicker of something else beneath the surface, fear that matched his own. "To a safe house," she said. "It's a place I've used before. We'll lay low for a while until we can figure out our next move." Richard nodded slowly. "And then what? You're telling me that all this is about my project, my company, this group, whoever they are, they've been planning this for months?" Emily hesitated, and for a moment Richard thought she might not answer. But then she spoke, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her knowledge. "Yes, this isn't just about business, Richard. It's bigger than that. They believe your technology has the potential to change the world. In their hands, it could be used to control everything. Everything we know, politics, power, information. They want to harness it, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Richard's stomach turned. He had known that his project was groundbreaking, but he had never considered the implications of it on such a scale. What had begun as a tool for innovation had now become a weapon of mass influence. He felt a sinking sensation in his chest as the weight of the situation settled on him. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do we stop them?" Emily glanced over at him, her expression resolute. "We fight back. But first we need to get to the safe house. We can't make any moves until we're secure." Richard didn't argue. He knew better than to question her judgment right now. She had already proven herself to be more than capable of navigating the mess they were in. But as much as he trusted her, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The longer they stayed on the road, the closer the danger seemed to get. The city lights faded as they left the urban sprawl behind and ventured into the outskirts. The streets became emptier, darker. The car turned down a winding road that led into the forest. Richard's mind wandered as he gazed out the window, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the past few hours. What was this group? How had they managed to infiltrate his company? And why had Emily become involved in all of this? He glanced at her, trying to read her face. There was something she wasn't telling him, something deeper than the surface level explanations she had given so far, but he didn't press her. Not yet. They were still in danger, and he knew it. Whatever she was holding back, he would find out soon enough. The car slowed as they approached a small, isolated cabin. Emily's tense posture relaxed slightly, but only for a moment. Richard followed her as she exited the vehicle, his heart still racing. The night air was cool and crisp, the sound of rustling leaves filling the silence. They stood in front of the cabin for a moment, surveying the area. "Are we safe here?" Richard asked, his voice filled with doubt. "For now," Emily replied, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "But we have to be careful. They'll be looking for us soon. We need to lay low until we can make contact with someone who can help us." Richard nodded, but he couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. He wasn't just running from an anonymous group anymore. He was running from his own creation, the project he had worked so hard to develop. The very thing that had given him success now seemed like the thing that would destroy everything. Inside the cabin, Emily went straight to a locked drawer and pulled out a small laptop. She plugged it in and began typing rapidly. Richard watched her for a moment before his gaze drifted to the window. The darkness outside seemed to close in, the weight of their situation becoming more suffocating by the second. After a few minutes, Emily turned to him, her face grim. "We've got company," she said quietly. "They've found us." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask how she knew. He could feel it too. The tension in the air, the feeling that someone was watching them. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice low, his pulse pounding in his ears. Emily glanced at the laptop screen. "Not long, maybe 20 minutes tops." Richard didn't hesitate. "What do we do?" "We fight," Emily said, her eyes steely. "We have no choice." For the next few minutes, everything happened in a blur of action. Emily moved quickly, pulling out a series of tools from the drawer and setting them up on a nearby table. Richard watched her, his mind racing, but he couldn't keep up with everything she was doing. "Are you armed?" Emily asked suddenly, her tone sharp. Richard nodded. "I've got a gun in the bag." "Good. Take it out," she instructed. Not looking up from what she was doing, Richard did as she said, the weight of the weapon in his hands giving him a brief sense of security. It was strange, holding a gun for the first time in years. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to focus. Emily was already moving, checking the windows, securing the doors. The clock was ticking, and Richard could feel the pressure mounting. "With each passing second, we need to stay quiet," Emily said, her voice low. "If they come in here, we need to be ready. They'll be armed." Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. The sound of distant footsteps reached his ears, and he knew they were close. A loud knock at the door sent both of them into action. Richard's heart raced as he gripped the gun tighter, his fingers trembling. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Stay down," Emily whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered in her eyes. Richard crouched low, his breath shallow, as Emily moved toward the door. She pressed her ear against it, listening intently. "They're trying to get in," she whispered. "We don't have much time." Suddenly, the door handle turned. The door handle rattled violently as the footsteps outside grew louder, echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, his fingers white-knuckled around the gun. He could feel the tension building with every second that passed. Emily had her back pressed against the wall, her eyes fixed on the door as she held her breath. The sense of urgency was palpable, and Richard knew that time was quickly running out. "Get ready," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard barely had time to process her words before the door exploded open with a loud bang, the hinges screeching in protest. 4 figures burst into the cabin, their black-clad silhouettes looming like shadows in the dim light. The world seemed to slow for a brief moment as Richard's mind raced. They had found them. The group was here, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. He could already see the guns in their hands, their cold, calculating eyes focused on him and Emily. Emily reacted instantly, her movements fluid and precise as she dropped to the floor, grabbing a rifle from a nearby crate. The sound of the weapon being loaded was sharp, echoing through the cabin. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he watched her spring into action. She was fearless. This wasn't the woman he had met at the restaurant, the one who seemed like she was hiding something. This was someone else entirely, someone trained, someone who had clearly dealt with danger before. Richard felt a surge of adrenaline as he snapped into action, his hand pulling the trigger instinctively. The shot rang out, and one of the figures collapsed to the floor, his body twitching before going still. The remaining 3 didn't flinch. They were professionals, calm, collected, and deadly. "Stay down," Emily shouted as she fired another shot, hitting one of the attackers square in the chest. The figure crumpled to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. The remaining two were fast. They returned fire, their bullets ricocheting off the walls and furniture. Richard ducked behind a nearby table, the air filled with the staccato sound of gunfire. His heart raced, his thoughts consumed by the realization that this was no longer a game. This was real, and they were fighting for their lives. But the chaos wasn't over. As Richard peeked over the edge of the table, he saw the final two attackers, moving quickly, using the furniture for cover as they inched closer. Emily was already repositioning herself, calculating her next move with military precision. "I need you to move when I say so," Emily instructed, her voice sharp as she lined up her shot. Richard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His hands were trembling, but he knew what he had to do. Emily was leading this, and he had no intention of questioning her now. She was the one who had kept them alive so far. When the moment came, Emily motioned for Richard to move. He bolted from behind the table, sprinting toward the doorway that led to the back of the cabin. A bullet whizzed past him, grazing the side of his arm, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the shouts of the attackers as they pursued him, but he didn't dare look back. Emily fired again, her shot hitting one of the attackers in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining one, the leader, was closing in fast, his gun aimed straight at Richard. "Get down!" Emily screamed, leaping toward Richard. In an instant she tackled him to the ground, just as a bullet whizzed by, missing them both by inches. The force of the impact sent them rolling, and Richard found himself on the floor, panting, disoriented. But Emily was already on her feet, moving faster than he could follow. With one fluid motion, she grabbed the rifle from her back and aimed. It at the leader. He was standing just a few feet away, his gun raised, ready to pull the trigger. "No!" Richard shouted, instinctively reaching for her arm. He wasn't sure why he did it, but he didn't want her to kill him. Not like this. There had to be another way. Emily's eyes met his, her expression torn. But there was no time for hesitation. She turned back to the leader, her finger on the trigger, but just as she was about to fire, the man spoke. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice cold but pleading. "You're making a mistake." Emily's gaze faltered for a moment, but then she steadied herself. She could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears, but she refused to give in. She wasn't going to let this man, or anyone else, take away the one thing she had worked so hard for. "Tell me who you are," she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. The man smiled, a twisted, knowing smile that sent a chill down Richard's spine. "You already know who we are," he said. "We're the ones who'll take everything from you." The words hung in the air as Richard's mind spun. Who was this man? And why did he feel like he had just revealed something critical? Before Richard could react, Emily fired, the shot hitting the man in the chest. He dropped to the ground, his gun clattering uselessly beside him, but Richard couldn't focus on the victory. He was still reeling from the cryptic words the man had spoken. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice steady. She didn't look back at the bodies on the floor. She didn't have time for that. Not now. Richard nodded, his mind still trying to piece everything together. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The danger wasn't over. It couldn't be. "We're not safe yet," Richard muttered. "There's more of them. I can feel it." Emily's eyes narrowed. She had the same feeling. She wasn't just trying to get out of this alive. She was trying to outsmart an enemy she didn't fully understand. And that scared her more than anything. The safe house wasn't as safe as it had seemed. They had no time to rest, no time to celebrate their small victory. The attackers they had faced in the cabin were only the beginning. The group was large, and they were getting closer. Emily quickly packed up their supplies, throwing them into a bag as Richard stood guard by the window. The quiet of the cabin seemed like an illusion now. He could sense the danger approaching from all sides, and he knew that Emily was right. They had to keep moving. "They're coming," Richard said, his voice tight with urgency. Emily nodded, her face grim. She had known this would happen, but she hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. They were up against a force much more powerful than she had anticipated. They had only scratched the surface, and now it was a race against time. "We need to get to the city," she said. "I have a contact there who might be able to help us, someone who knows more about this group." Richard's heart sank. A contact? Who? Emily didn't answer immediately. She grabbed her jacket, slinging it over her shoulder. "You'll meet him soon enough," she said. "But we need to move now." They exited the cabin quickly, moving swiftly through the woods as the sound of distant sirens echoed in the night. Richard didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Emily, though, seemed like the only person who understood the situation, but even she didn't have all the answers. And that was what scared him the most. The next few days would be critical. If they could stay ahead of the group, maybe they would survive long enough to find out who was behind this attack and why they had targeted Richard in the first place. But one thing was certain. His life, as he knew it, was over. And the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. The days since the attack on the cabin had blurred into a haze of movement and fear. Richard and Emily had spent every waking hour in constant motion, never staying in one place too long. They had crossed the border into another state, changed their identities, and even altered their plans, all in the name of survival. The danger was closing in on them faster than Richard could have ever anticipated. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, one question continued to gnaw at him. Who were the people chasing them? And why? He had learned nothing in the past few days that could shed any light on their true motives. Emily had her theories, but she had been reluctant to share all the details with him. The cryptic words from the man they'd killed, the one who had warned them that they were the ones who would take everything, still echoed in his mind. By now, they had reached the city, an unfamiliar, bustling metropolis that felt both like a safe haven and a trap. It was the kind of place where anonymity was easy, but also where shadows lurked in every corner. Emily had insisted that she had a contact here, someone who could give them the answers they so desperately needed. But Richard wasn't sure he trusted anyone anymore. As they made their way through the crowded streets, Richard's mind raced. He had never felt more out of control in his life. The project he had worked so hard to build, the one that had been his ticket to success, had now become a symbol of everything that was wrong in the world. And yet, despite all the danger, the conspiracy, and the violence, there was one thing Richard couldn't deny. He had come too far to back down now. The question of survival was no longer about staying alive. It was about finding the truth and making sure that the people who had used him as a pawn paid for it. Emily led the way down narrow alleyways and through unmarked doors, never pausing, never slowing down. It wasn't until they reached an old, abandoned building at the edge of the city that she stopped. "Here we are," she said, her voice barely audible. She turned to Richard, her eyes filled with something darker than usual. "This is it. You're about to meet him." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "The contact I've been telling you about. He's the one who can help us, the one who knows more about the—" The door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 40s, dressed in a worn suit. His hair was graying at the temples, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. He didn't smile as he stepped aside to let them in. "You're late," the man said, his voice gravelly. "But I guess you didn't have much of a choice." "We need your help," Emily said, her voice tense. "We're being hunted." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Richard for a moment, his gaze piercing. Finally, he nodded and motioned for them to enter. "Come in. We'll talk inside." As Richard stepped into the room, he could feel the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the moment that everything was about to change. And for the first time, he had a sense that he might actually learn the truth. The room was small, but functional, with a desk piled high with papers and old files. A single computer sat in the corner, its screen displaying a string of encrypted codes that Richard couldn't decipher. "Sit," the man instructed. "We don't have much time." Richard took a seat at the desk, his mind still racing. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why are you helping us?" The man sat down across from him, leaning back in his chair. "You can call me Robert. And as for why I'm helping you, it's simple. I have information you need, information that will answer all your questions." Emily sat beside Richard, her body tense, waiting for Robert to speak. Richard didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this man held the key to understanding everything. "So what do you know?" Richard asked, his voice impatient. "Who are these people? Who are they really?" Robert stared at him for a long moment before answering. "They are not just any group. They're a shadow organization that operates in the background of every major power struggle in the world. They have infiltrated governments, businesses, and even scientific research. They've been pulling strings for decades, shaping history without anyone noticing." Richard's head spun. "And my project? How does that fit into this?" Robert leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Your project is a game changer, Richard. It's not just about technology or innovation. It's about power, control over information, surveillance, communication, and even human consciousness. The group believes that whoever controls this technology will be able to dictate the future of humanity, and that's why they want it." Richard felt a cold chill settle in his bones. His project wasn't just some business venture, it was the key to everything. And now, he realized, it was too late to back out. The world would never be the same. "But why me?" Richard asked. "Why did they target me? Why did you get involved?" Robert's face softened and he leaned back in his chair. "Because they knew you were the one who could make it happen. You're the one who had the skills, the resources, and the ambition to see this project through. They were waiting for someone like you, someone who could push the boundaries of science and technology. And when you created this project, they saw it as their opportunity." Emily's eyes flickered with understanding. "And they used me to get to him," she said quietly. "They knew I was close to him. That's why I got involved." Robert nodded. "Exactly. They used you to get close, to manipulate him, to make sure the project was successful, and then they tried to take it from him. They've been watching you both from the beginning." Richard felt the weight of the situation sink in. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a business deal or a corporate rivalry. It was a battle for control, for the future of the world itself. "So, what now?" Richard asked. "What do we do?" Robert's expression darkened. "Now, we fight back. We expose them for what they are. But we have to move quickly. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop them. They've already infiltrated too many levels of power. If we don't act soon, they'll control everything." Richard's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But there was no turning back now. "You're sure we can take them down?" Richard asked, his voice filled with determination. "We have to," Robert said. "The future of everything depends on it." The plan was simple, though fraught with danger. They would leak information to the media, expose the group's true intentions, and show the world what they had been trying to hide. It was a risky move, but it was the only chance they had. Over the next few days, Richard and Emily worked tirelessly, contacting trusted allies, preparing their evidence, and making the necessary arrangements. But as they moved forward, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Finally, the day arrived. Richard stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared to speak. The Press, the public, and even the government were watching. This was his moment to expose everything. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "The truth is simple," Richard said, his voice steady. "We've been lied to. We've been manipulated by a shadow organization that seeks to control not just technology, but the very future of humanity. And today, we're taking back control. We will expose them for what they are, and we will stop them." The crowd erupted in applause, but Richard's eyes were fixed on something else. The look in Emily's eyes. She was standing beside him, her face full of determination, but there was something else too. Something that said the fight was far from over. The lesson was clear. The future was uncertain, and power could be dangerous when left unchecked. But as long as there were people like Richard and Emily willing to fight for the truth, there was hope. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he had regained control of his own destiny. The end.